Hello everybody, welcome back to the workshop. If you're a fan of my channel, you've seen me use my sharpening station here on several occasions. In fact, I even have a video on how I put it together. If you're so interested, I invite you to check that out. So, spoiler alert, I took the board and the stones and the assemblage of all the little jigs and widgets and turned it from this into this, and I'm able to store it all in here. And I think it's a much better solution for me. So if you're interested to see my logic and reasoning, stick around and let's get to it. I've used it for a couple years and generally I'm pretty happy with it. There's a couple things I like about this and don't like about it. The station holds 3 stones, and these 2, you can flip them over to get 2 additional grits. And I have an area over here that I thought I would use for stropping. And when sharpening a plane iron, it's particularly convenient. Once you get it set up, you just go down through the grits, do a little stropping, and before you know it, you've got a pretty sharp iron. So the biggest advantage to having a station like this is you have everything right here. And this PVC station always holds these 2 stones. So I always have these ready to go. This, however, is a water stone, and when I'm not using it, I need to keep it in this watertight container. And of course, the strops are free floating, and I have a bunch of other and sundry jigs and pieces that help me when I sharpen things like irons. And I've also found lately I've been sharpening knives on this station, and it works pretty well for that as well. So if I could leave this station set up just like this full time, that would be particularly convenient. But I can't. What I end up doing is when this is not in use, I put the water stone away and then I lift this up and I lean it over in a corner of my workshop. So anytime I need to sharpen, the fact I can grab this and it's got the 2 stones set up, well, that's not so bad, but it's really not that great of a time saver. And it crosses my mind as I've been sharpening, it's just not that big of a deal to move around a couple stones. When not in use, I keep my water stone in this Apache case. I got it Harbor Freight. And it has this little rubber or silicone tray in it that I find convenient to help pad the stone. And I actually went out and bought a second one of these, and I didn't need the silicone tray for that application, so I have an extra one, and I think this will be convenient for using the stone when it's not being stored in the case. One useful feature of this station is I've got these blocks here that help me set up an iron in my Veritas gauge. There's a flat on the gauge down here, and you line that up on the edge and center it, and with a little dexterity you can snug that down, and now the iron is square because it's lined up on this edge, and that distance will give me a 25-degree bevel. However, I did take the time to make a separate piece where I've got actually 4 choices of angles that I can use, and this has proved to be pretty useful as well. This stone here is made of steel, and it's very heavy, and I find that when I move this whole station around, a lot of times these cleats over here will break off and I have to re-glue them. Then over on this side I have this area for putting the strop down, but since this entire station always sits on the workbench, you don't really need a piece of PVC for the strop. So this whole area is kind of a waste. The overall width is a little convenient in the sense I can lean it up on its edge and I don't have to bend too far to pick that up, but how much is that worth? And finally, another drawback to a station like this is I do a lot of sharpening with my Veritas jig, and a lot of times I need to flip it over to get to the back side of the iron, and the jig itself interferes with the bench. I need the stones to be lifted up, and even if I could get to this edge, and getting on that stone is not convenient, so I find a lot of times I hold it in my hand and I do the flattening that way. So that's not particularly convenient. And finally, when working with knives, sometimes I like to go in on this area, and the fact that I have a stone down here interferes with my knuckles sometimes. So this particular setup doesn't seem to be terribly conducive to freehand knife sharpening. And finally, I typically put this station when not in use in one particular area of my shop. I have all these in sundry pieces that help me with my sharpening, and they're kept typically in one of the drawers down underneath here. The water stone is kept somewhere else in this container, and my strop is kept somewhere else. So anytime I have to sharpen, I typically have to assemble several of these pieces before I can actually get going. So having this particular station doesn't solve that issue. So I've got a couple ideas going forward. I'm going to make individual holders for each of these 3 stones. Well, I've got this done, and it actually seems to work pretty well. It's easy enough to flip the stone over, and it's pretty stable on this rubber pad. And I had to put an iron in my jig, and it seems pretty good. However, after I do this, I usually flip it over while it's in the jig and try to do the underside, and we still have a problem. So if I take my strop, for example, and just lift it up, then that's a little more convenient. So lesson learned for the way I sharpen. I'd like this lifted up a little more, so I got to give that some thought. So this is where I'm at. I made 2 of these blocks, one for each of these stones. They're a little bit different but very similar. In fact, you can swap either of these stones. Where this one has just a sharp edge, I've got a bigger block on it, but the DMT stones have a little bit of a lip, so there's a smaller block. And I think gravity will hold these fine. To lift it up off the bench, I simply made a piece of white oak about the right size so I can stack these as I need. And that seems as though it's an elegant, easy solution. And for the water stone, I put it in and used it like so. Off camera, I took the time to cut the top off of this rubber tray. And I also have this toolbox that I don't really use, and I'm wondering if it makes sense to maybe put these things in here. So I find this setup is actually kind of convenient for sharpening a knife. I can put a stone up here easy enough, and then I have easy access to all sides of the stone. I don't have to worry about wrapping my knuckles down on whatever happens to be next to the stone. And when it's time to move on, you just set this aside, grab the finer grit, and then finally move on to the water stone. Well, this setup works pretty well. I have my whetstone in the case down in the bottom here, and the heavy stone with the extra piece of oak here, and my DMT stone is up on this. And then in the very top shelf, I've got my tray with all my various little jigs and widgets to help me sharpen. And it all fits in this old toolbox, and I get to give it a second life. So time will tell how well it's worked. I've used it a few times. I'm pretty happy with it. I'm not going to be throwing away my PVC sharpening station just yet, but I think this is going to be a little more convenient for me. So in my opinion, if you've got the space in your shop to have a full-time station set up and you're really good at freehand sharpening, then that's probably the way to go. But for me, where I don't really have the space, then I think the individual stones, the way I have it set up, is probably a better solution. And it also crosses my mind that this is much more portable, and I could take this anywhere. So, as always, hope you got something out of the video. Thanks for making it this far. And like, subscribe if you will. And as always, stay safe, take care, keep your eyes out for the next one.